An 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie was dropped off at her home around 9:50 p.m. by her son-in-law. She said goodnight. She went inside. And at some point, between that moment and the next morning, she vanished, out of a house with the doors locked, in a neighborhood where everybody supposedly notices everything. 5 months later, despite an FBI-led multi-agency investigation, despite a $1.2 million reward, despite ransom notes and DNA evidence and thousands of hours of surveillance footage, Nancy Guthrie has still not been found. And the case has pulled in a name millions of Americans recognize every weekday morning: her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. This is the story of what we know, what doesn't add up, and why. 5 months later, the answer to this case might already be sitting in someone's memory, waiting for them to make the call. Before we get into the theories, the forensics, and the ransom notes, it's worth slowing down on who Nancy Guthrie actually was. Because in cases like this, the victim so easily becomes a name in a headline, and we lose the person underneath it. Nancy Ellen Guthrie, born Nancy Ellen Long, came into the world on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She moved to the Tucson area in the early 1970s with her family and stayed for more than 50 years, long enough to watch the Catalina foothills grow up around her, long enough to become one of those fixtures of a community that everyone simply assumes will always be there. She was widowed young, in a sense. Her husband, Charles Guthrie, died at just 49 years old during a mining exploration trip in Mexico back in 1988. That left Nancy to raise 3 children largely on her own: Cameron, Annie, and Savannah. By the time January 2026 rolled around, Nancy was 84. Family members describe her as mentally sharp. Sharp as a tack, in the words of people close to her. Fiercely independent, and still living alone in her home. But independence didn't mean she was without vulnerabilities. She had limited mobility and couldn't walk very far without assistance. She required daily medication for a chronic health condition. She also had a pacemaker, a detail that would later become strangely important to the investigation. She was, by every account, deeply embedded in her community, a regular churchgoer, active in her social circle, the kind of woman who had a routine and stuck to it, including a habit of watching her church's services through a live stream when she couldn't attend in person. On Saturday, January 31st, Nancy had dinner with family. Her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, married to her daughter Annie, drove her home afterward and dropped her off at approximately 9:50 p.m. That moment, as far as anyone has been able to determine, is the last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie alive. Cioni is, to this day, the last known person to have seen her. The next morning, Sunday, February 1st, Nancy didn't show up for her scheduled church live stream. For a woman whose habits were as consistent as hers, that absence registered immediately as wrong. A member of her church noticed and reached out to the family. Concerned, relatives went to check on her around 11 a.m. What they found was a house that looked in some ways untouched, and in other ways deeply unsettling. They searched the home and the surrounding property. There was no sign of Nancy. Around noon, the family called 911. When deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrived, they noted something investigators would return to again and again in the months ahead. Nancy's personal belongings, including her phone, were still inside the house. She hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't taken her medication with her. Given her limited mobility and the complete absence of any sign that she'd left on her own, investigators reached a conclusion almost immediately. This was not a woman who had wandered off, or left voluntarily, or suffered a medical event alone on a walk. This was an abduction. Once investigators treated the house as a crime scene, the picture got darker fast. Blood was found inside the property. It would later be confirmed, through testing, to be Nancy's own blood, a detail that told investigators this hadn't been a clean, bloodless abduction. Something had happened inside that home, something that involved physical violence or a struggle significant enough to leave evidence behind. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, who would become the public face of this investigation for months to come, stated plainly that he believed Nancy had been abducted, not wandered off, not a voluntary disappearance, abducted. A multi-agency task force assembled almost immediately, the Pima County Sheriff's Department in the lead, with the FBI, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and search and rescue teams all brought in given Tucson's proximity to the U.S.-Mexico border. From the outset, this wasn't being treated as a routine missing persons case. It was being treated as exactly what the evidence suggested, a kidnapping with the clock already running. And then came the camera footage. Nancy's home had a doorbell camera system. For days after her disappearance, investigators worked to recover footage from it. Footage that, it would turn out, had been tampered with. On February 10th, 10 days after Nancy vanished, the FBI released newly recovered images and video showing what FBI Director Kash Patel described as an armed individual who appeared to have tampered with the camera at Nancy's front door on the very morning of her disappearance. The footage showed a masked figure, average build, an estimated 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, according to the FBI's later analysis, wearing a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack backpack. The figure moved with what investigators would later characterize as purpose, not panic. He wasn't running, he wasn't fumbling. He was doing something specific to that one camera, in a way that suggested he understood exactly what it was, and exactly why it needed to be dealt with. Here's where the timeline gets stranger. CBS later reported that the masked suspect could be seen in security footage that may have been recorded before February 1st, potentially as early as January 11th, weeks before Nancy disappeared, though Google, which assisted in extracting and analyzing footage from the home's connected devices, later clarified they couldn't confirm that exact date with certainty. In that earlier footage, notably, the suspect wasn't wearing the backpack. Think about what that detail means if true. If the same individual was casing this property weeks in advance, coming back at least once before the night it mattered, this was not a crime of impulse. This was a plan that had been rehearsed. In the early days of the investigation, before the full picture had come into focus, one theory floated through local reporting. Maybe this was a burglary gone wrong, a break-in that escalated when the intruder was confronted by an elderly woman alone in her home. It's a tempting theory because it's simple, and simple theories are comforting. They suggest a chaotic, almost accidental tragedy rather than something colder and more deliberate. But sit with the logic for a moment, and it falls apart. A burglar's entire strategy is built around minimizing risk and minimizing time on scene. Get in, find cash or jewelry or electronics, get out, and if a homeowner wakes up or walks in, the standard response is to flee, not to escalate. Every additional minute spent in a stranger's home increases the odds of getting caught. Every additional action taken increases the odds of leaving evidence. So ask yourself, why would a panicked, opportunistic burglar choose, in the middle of being potentially discovered, to abduct an 84-year-old woman? Walk through what that decision actually requires. You need a vehicle nearby, ready to go. You need precise timing, because every extra second is a second where a neighbor's porch light flicks on, or a car drives past. You need to navigate unfamiliar desert streets in the dark, in a neighborhood full of cul-de-sacs and private roads that don't behave like a normal grid. You need to physically control a victim who might scream, who might struggle, who might be recognized by someone if you're not careful. And you need somewhere to take her. That's not the profile of panic. That's the profile of a plan that already existed before anyone knocked on that door. So if it wasn't a burglary that escalated, what was it? Investigators and outside analysts have generally circled three possibilities. The first, the intruder was somehow recognized by Nancy and abducted her specifically to prevent her from identifying him later. A desperate, fear-driven decision rather than a calculated one. The second, she was taken specifically to coerce access to financial information, bank accounts, passwords, anything of value that required her specifically to be alive and compliant, at least for a while. The third, and the one that's gained the most traction as the investigation has unfolded. The burglary framing was never accurate to begin with. It was a story that fit the early, limited evidence, but it was wrong. Nancy herself, not anything inside her house, was the target from the very beginning. Sheriff Nanos has hinted at this directly. In comments early in the case, he said investigators believed they knew why this happened, that they believed it was targeted, while cautioning that they weren't entirely certain. "We believe we know why he did this, and we believe that it was targeted," he said, "but we're not 100% sure of that, so it'd be silly to tell people, don't worry about it." That's about as close as a sheriff gets publicly to saying, "This wasn't random, and we have a theory about the motive that we're not ready to share." If you're looking for proof that this crime didn't begin the night Nancy disappeared, the security camera is where you start. To disable or tamper with a home security system without immediately triggering alarms, without alerting a homeowner, without leaving an obvious mess, that takes either inside knowledge or outside patience. There are really only two ways to get there. One, you had legitimate prior access to that home, maybe as a worker, a contractor, someone who'd been inside before and had reason to know where the cameras were, how the system was wired, what the blind spots looked like. Two, you didn't have access, so you built the knowledge yourself, through days or weeks of quiet surveillance, watching the property from a distance, mapping out exactly where the cameras could and couldn't see. Learning the rhythm of the house the same way the neighbors had learned the rhythm of the street. Either path requires the same thing: time spent thinking about this specific house before the night it happened. Then there's the physical evidence collected in the surrounding area. And this is where the investigation got genuinely strange. Investigators ultimately collected 16 separate gloves from various points near Nancy's home. Most were discarded almost immediately as unrelated debris, but one, found along roadside brush about 2 miles from the house, carried an unknown male DNA profile and initially drew intense interest because investigators believed it resembled gloves worn by the suspect seen in the doorbell footage. For weeks, that glove was treated as a potentially major piece of evidence. Then, in March, the sheriff's department announced the DNA had been traced, not to a suspect, but to a local restaurant worker with no connection to the case at all. It didn't match the National CODIS database. It didn't match the DNA recovered from Nancy's home. A dead end, but a telling one. It showed just how much physical trace evidence gets left behind in suburban environments by people who have nothing to do with a crime, and how much careful elimination work investigators have had to do just to isolate what's actually relevant. The DNA recovered from Nancy's property has been a different story. Investigators have described it as a mixed profile, meaning more than one person's genetic material, including, according to later reporting, a hair sample. That mixed profile has been run against CODIS, the FBI's national database of more than 19 million offender profiles, without a match. Investigators have since pursued genetic genealogy options, a newer forensic technique that can sometimes identify unknown DNA by tracing family trees through public genealogy databases, even without a direct criminal record match. As of the most recent updates, no identification has been confirmed. And what about the masked figure himself? The one piece of visual evidence the public has actually seen. Investigators studying that footage have paid close attention not just to his physical description, but to how he moved. His direction of travel, the route he chose, whether he appeared to actively avoid the visible edges of camera frames. That kind of movement, purposeful, camera-aware, doesn't look like someone improvising in an unfamiliar place. It looks like someone who had studied the geometry of that property and that street well enough to move through it like he already knew the answer key. In any case like this, investigators have to look hard at the people closest to the victim, not because anyone assumes guilt, but because statistically, it's where these cases most often lead. That scrutiny extended to Nancy's family, including her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, the last person known to have seen her alive, and to her daughter Annie's home, where authorities were seen searching, primarily in the garage, at one point during the investigation. But on February 16th, Sheriff Nanos made a public statement that left little room for ambiguity. "To be clear," he said, "the Guthrie family, to include all siblings and spouses, has been cleared as possible suspects in this case. The family has been nothing but cooperative and gracious, and are victims in this case." That's a significant statement, and it's worth sitting with for a second because it closes off one of the most common and honestly most exhausting threads that tends to follow cases like this on social media. The family didn't do this. They've been ruled out, formally, by the lead investigator on the case. Whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie, it came from outside that family circle. This is where the case takes its most disturbing turn, and where the public story and the private investigation start to diverge in ways that are still being untangled 5 months later. In the days immediately following Nancy's disappearance, something unusual started happening. Media outlets, not the family, began receiving letters from people claiming to be responsible for her abduction. The first arrived on February 2nd, sent to 2 local Tucson news stations and to TMZ. It demanded payment in cryptocurrency. According to later reporting, this letter included specific, unsettling details about Nancy's home. A broken light on the back porch, a white-banded Apple Watch left on her bedroom floor. These weren't generic details a random opportunist could guess. They were the kind of details that suggested the writer had either been inside that home or had detailed knowledge of it from someone who had. Investigators took it seriously enough to involve the FBI immediately, while publicly declining to confirm its authenticity. On February 5th, Nancy's son Cameron posted a video addressing whoever was holding his mother directly. "Whoever is out there holding our mother, we want to hear from you. We haven't heard anything directly. We need you to reach out, and we need a way to communicate with you so we can move forward. But first, we have to know that you have our mom." 2 days later, on February 7th, the family received what they describe as direct contact. Savannah, alongside her siblings, posted a video statement. "We received your message, and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. This is very valuable to us, and we will pay." The specifics of that demand became public through CNN affiliate K-Gun, which had received one of the letters, $6 million, with a deadline of 5 p.m. on Monday, February 9th. That deadline came. It passed. No further contact, no proof of life, nothing. But there had been a second note, one whose full contents the public wouldn't learn for another 4.5 months. That second letter, according to multiple sources who spoke to ABC News and other outlets, arrived within days of the first. It made no ransom demand at all. Instead, it claimed that Nancy had died shortly after being taken, and that her body had been left somewhere out in the desert, described in the note as being buried in nature. Investigators reportedly assessed this note as a potentially legitimate communication from whoever was actually involved and chose to keep its contents private, not to protect the family from the truth, but specifically to avoid interfering with an active investigation in case further correspondence came from the same source. The public didn't learn what that note said until June 22nd, almost 5 months after it was received. When that detail broke, Savannah Guthrie was on air. She told her colleague, "I don't have any comment on this story, and I'm not involved in our coverage, but I can't pretend I'm not here. And so since I am, I want to just take the opportunity to ask people, to beg people, to come forward. Somebody knows something. This is a new story today that is on your radar, but this is the life that my sister lives, that I live, that my brother lives, that our extended families live, that our children live every day. And we are in agony. We cannot be at peace." In the months between those two moments, receiving that note in February and the public learning about it in June, Countless other letters arrived, claiming responsibility, claiming knowledge, claiming all sorts of things. Savannah has since said she believes only two of them were ever real: the ransom demand and the note claiming her mother had died. Everything else, she suspects, came from opportunists exploiting a grieving, very public family. That instinct lines up with something retired FBI hostage negotiators have pointed out publicly. Legitimate kidnappers overwhelmingly prefer to negotiate directly and privately with a victim's family. Going to the media instead, repeatedly from multiple apparent sources, is unusual. It suggests either a desire for public pressure on the investigation itself, or in the case of the fake letters, people chasing attention by attaching themselves to a story already dominating the news. That pattern hasn't stopped. Just this past week, on June 25th, TMZ reported receiving yet another letter, this one from someone claiming two people were involved in Nancy's kidnapping, and that a phone stored somewhere secure contained footage of both the main guy and Nancy herself. Sheriff Nanos responded directly, calling it likely another fake, one more attempt, in his view, to exploit a case that has never stopped generating headlines. While the ransom notes played out in public, the actual search for Nancy moved through phases that ranged from painstaking to genuinely strange. Given Tucson's proximity to the U.S.-Mexico border, investigators briefed U.S. Border Patrol agents and Mexican law enforcement early on, asking officials on both sides to watch for anything relevant. On February 10th, a person of interest was detained following a traffic stop in Rio Rico, Arizona, about 60 miles south of Tucson, close to the border. The Sheriff's Department and FBI executed search warrants on a property and vehicle in the same area. By February 11th, the searches had concluded, and the individual was released without charges. Sheriff Nanos confirmed the person had no connection to the case. 2 days later, on February 13th, the Sheriff's Department conducted an operation at a residence just 2 miles from Nancy's home. 2 people were removed from the property, and the surrounding roads were closed to the public for roughly 4 hours. No public connection between that residence and Nancy's disappearance was ever confirmed. The physical search itself ranged from methodical to almost surreal. Investigators were seen examining the septic tank near Nancy's property, using a long stick and a flashlight to check inside. They canvassed homes and businesses for surveillance footage, a process officials described as reviewing thousands of hours of video, slowing it down frame by frame, looking for anything out of place. They visited gun shops around Tucson. At one point, authorities even deployed a so-called signal sniffer via helicopter, hoping to detect a transmission from Nancy's pacemaker, a detail that captures just how far investigators were willing to go, chasing even the faintest possible signal that she might still be out there, alive, somewhere within range. In June, a new and heartbreaking thread emerged. People magazine reported that a tip had been received by a Mexican volunteer search group, Buscando Corazones Nogales, searching hearts of Nogales, claiming Nancy was deceased and buried near Nogales along the U.S.-Mexico border. The group conducted a local search based on that tip. It turned up nothing. Separately, another Mexican volunteer organization, Madres Buscadoras de Sonora, searching mothers of Sonora, placed a missing person poster for Nancy about a mile from her home in late February. A quiet, grassroots gesture from a group that has spent years searching for missing people along the border, extending that same effort north into Arizona, for a woman they'd likely never have heard of under ordinary circumstances. It's worth pausing here, because so much of true crime coverage focuses on forensics and theories and timelines, and it's easy to lose sight of the fact that this is happening to real people, in real time, with the entire country watching. Savannah Guthrie suspended her broadcasting duties almost immediately, including stepping away from co-hosting the opening ceremonies of the 2026 Winter Olympics, to be with her family in Tucson. She stayed away from Today for more than 2 months. When she finally visited the studio in early March, a source present told reporters she thanked her colleagues for caring about my mom as much as I do, and said, "I don't know how to come back, but I don't know how not to. You're my family, and I would like to try." She returned to the show on April 6th, in her first interview since the abduction, speaking with her longtime friend and former co-host Hoda Kotb. She said simply, "Honestly, we don't know anything." She described her family as being in agony, unable to find peace, and made a direct appeal. Someone can do the right thing, and it is never too late to do the right thing. In that same interview, Savannah said something that gives a window into the particular, almost unbearable guilt that comes with being a public figure whose private tragedy becomes a national story. She said she believes her own fame might be the reason her mother was targeted, that the thought of her own profile bringing this danger to her mother's doorstep was, in her words, too much to bear. "I just say I'm so sorry, Mommy," she said. "I'm so sorry. If it is me, I'm so sorry." Whether that's actually true, whether Nancy was targeted because of who her daughter is, remains one of the open questions investigators haven't answered publicly. But the fact that Savannah carries that fear at all says something about how thoroughly this case has reshaped her sense of her own life and her own visibility. Since returning to the show, producers have reportedly built specific protocols around how breaking news in the case gets handled on air, sequestering Savannah from the set when new developments break, letting other anchors carry the story while she's kept apart from it in the moment. It's a strange, almost clinical accommodation for an almost unthinkable situation. A journalist who has to be protected from her own network's coverage of her own mother's disappearance. The toll has shown in smaller ways too. In early June, Savannah took an unplanned day off, with a colleague filling in, described only as both she and her co-anchor needing a head start on the weekend after what had been described as a difficult week. The same week it would turn out that the contents of that second ransom note were finally made public. By May, the case had passed the 100-day mark. Sheriff Nanos, asked directly about where things stood, said investigators remained committed and that they believed, eventually, an arrest would be made. That's a notable thing for a sheriff to say on the record, in an active case with no named suspect, a public statement of confidence, even without evidence to back it up publicly yet. The reward for information has grown since the case began. The family's initial $1 million offer, posted February 24th, has since combined with other contributions to reach $1.2 million total for information leading to Nancy's recovery. Public frustration with the pace of the investigation has been impossible to ignore. Sheriff Nanos has acknowledged directly that some information has been deliberately withheld from the public, not because nothing is happening, but because revealing it could compromise the investigation itself. That's cold comfort to a public desperate for answers. But it's also, frankly, how serious investigations often have to work. The cases that get solved are rarely the ones where every detail gets broadcast in real time. Celebrity commentary has followed the case too, for better or worse. A reflection of just how deeply this story has embedded itself in the broader cultural conversation, well beyond Tucson, well beyond true crime circles. It's the kind of attention that can occasionally generate a useful tip from someone who wouldn't have been paying attention otherwise, and just as often generates noise, false leads, and more fake claims for investigators to sift through and rule out. And in the middle of all that noise, one thread that's drawn attention without, as far as has been publicly confirmed, any actual connection to the case. A woman named Coral Michelle Smith, 40 years old, wanted by the Pima County Sheriff's Department in connection with a separate kidnapping and aggravated assault investigation that occurred less than 7 miles from Nancy's home. Investigators have not linked her to Nancy's disappearance. A retired homicide detective, asked about it publicly, made the obvious but important point. In any major abduction case, investigators cast a wide net, and they look closely at anything involving a violent offender operating in the same general area, even when it ultimately leads nowhere. That's much of what an investigation like this actually looks like, day to day. Dozens of threads, most of which lead nowhere, each one requiring real time and real resources to rule out, while the public sees only the handful that make headlines. Here's a concept that shows up again and again in cases like this, and it's worth understanding because it might genuinely be the thing that breaks this case open. Community memory. Planned crimes, and by now the evidence strongly suggests this was planned, almost never begin on the day the victim disappears. They begin weeks earlier with quiet reconnaissance. And the person doing that reconnaissance almost never looks like a criminal. He looks explainable. A lost driver checking a phone at a stop sign, an unmarked utility vehicle parked at the curb, a contractor's truck seemingly waiting for a client who's running late. None of that registers as suspicious in the moment because none of it is supposed to. That's the whole point. A smart offender blends into the texture of a neighborhood rather than standing out against it. But neighborhoods like the Catalina foothills run on exactly the kind of casual observation that eventually defeats that strategy, just usually not right away. Community memory is the sum of all those tiny, seemingly insignificant fragments locked away in the minds of people who live nearby. One neighbor remembers a dark SUV parked oddly on a Monday morning, gone by afternoon. Another remembers a stranger walking unusually slowly past a driveway midweek, glancing at the house rather than the street. A third has a doorbell camera that caught a vehicle driving away on a Friday evening, the kind of clip you'd normally delete without a second thought. Individually, none of those memories feel significant enough to call a tip line about. They feel too vague, too small, possibly nothing at all. But when independent witnesses, people who don't know each other, who have no reason to coordinate their stories, report the same kind of detail, a pattern starts to emerge. A damaged bumper, a repeated time window, a specific make of vehicle showing up more than once on more than one camera. That pattern can then be cross-referenced against records that already exist. Phone location data, license plate readers, delivery logs, gas station receipts. What felt like nothing on its own becomes the thread that unravels everything. There's a reason fresh media coverage on cases like this doesn't always represent a confirmed breakthrough. Sometimes its real purpose is pressure and reassurance. It reminds people that an imperfect memory is still useful. It reminds the neighbor who saw something 3 months ago and talked themselves out of reporting it, because they weren't sure, because they didn't want to waste anyone's time, because they were maybe a little embarrassed about why they happened to be out walking at that hour or driving down that particular street, that it's not too late, and that the detail they're sitting on might matter more than they think. People stay quiet for reasons that have nothing to do with guilt, uncertainty, fear of being wrong. Sometimes, frankly, the desire to avoid revealing some small, unrelated personal secret that has nothing to do with the case at all. An affair, a private habit, anything that makes someone hesitant to explain why they were where they were when they happen to notice something. Investigators in cases like this know that hesitation exists, and they know that overcoming it, convincing one nervous witness that their small, blurry memory is worth a phone call, is sometimes worth more than any single piece of forensic evidence. 5 months after Nancy Guthrie vanished from a quiet, predictable street in the Catalina foothills, the investigation remains active, and the public record remains full of holes by design. Not because nothing is happening, but because the people running this case have decided, deliberately, that some things are safer left unsaid for now. What we do know paints the picture of a crime that was planned, not improvised. A security camera disabled with apparent intent, possibly weeks of prior surveillance. A masked figure who moved through that property like he already understood its blind spots. And a family left with nothing but unconfirmed letters and a silence that has now stretched past 150 days. Sheriff Nanos has said he believes an arrest will eventually come. Savannah Guthrie continues to split her life between a network morning show watched by millions and a house in the desert where her mother was last seen alive. And somewhere, maybe in that same neighborhood, maybe miles away, there may be a person holding on to a memory they've decided isn't important enough to report. A car, a stranger, A few minutes on a Tuesday afternoon that felt like nothing at the time. In a case like this, that's so often where the real break comes from. Not a forensic miracle, not a dramatic confession. An ordinary person finally deciding that the small, blurry detail they noticed weeks before Nancy disappeared might be worth a phone call after all. If you have any information related to this case, investigators are asking you to come forward. You can contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department tip line at 520-351-4900, the Tucson 88 Crime Hotline at 1-520-882-7463, or the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. Every detail, even one that feels too small to matter, could be the one that brings Nancy Guthrie home.